Stories with Jane. Good morning, my dear listeners. Pull up a chair, pour yourself a cup of something warm, and settle in. There's no rush here. Tell me, have you ever been to a village harvest festival where the air smells of wood smoke and ripe apples, and everyone seems to know everyone else's secrets? If these quiet village mysteries bring you comfort, I'd be so grateful if you stayed a while and subscribed to Stories with Jane. It helps more than you know. And now, the story begins. Chapter 1. The First Bite of Autumn. Miss Jane Marple sat in the corner of the vicarage garden at St. Mary Mead, her knitting needles moving with the soft, regular click that had accompanied so many quiet afternoons. The year was 1934, and the first true chill of autumn had arrived overnight. A thin mist still clung to the lawns, and the leaves of the great oak by the gate had begun to turn the colour of old copper. The vicar's wife, Griselda Clement, came out carrying a tray with 2 cups of tea and a small plate of thin bread and butter. She set it down carefully on the wicker table. "Jane, you must come to the harvest festival at Little Folding this year," she said. "It's only 6 miles away, and they've asked the whole parish. There's to be a proper apple show, and they've invited that new young doctor from the hospital at Market Basing to judge the cider. Everyone's talking about it." Miss Marple smiled the small, thoughtful smile that never quite reached her eyes when she was already considering something else. "I haven't been to Little Folding since dear old Mrs. Bantry's cousin lived there," she replied. "A very quiet place, I always thought. Rather proud of its orchards." "Proud is the word," Griselda said. "They claim their russets are the finest in the county. This year they're giving the first prize a silver apple. Proper silver, mind you. And the winner gets to keep it until next harvest. There's already talk of who might take it. That rather sharp woman from the manor, Mrs. Harcourt, has been saying her trees produced twice the usual crop. And then there's old Mr. Truscott, who still climbs the ladders himself at 73. And the new people at the old mill, outsiders of course, have entered a tray of those long yellow apples no one here has seen before." Miss Marple's needles paused for half a second. "Outsiders?" she said mildly. "How long have they been at the old mill?" "Only since Easter. A brother and sister. He's a writer of some sort, rather pale and silent. She keeps house and sells eggs at the market. Quiet enough, but they don't come to church. People notice that sort of thing." Griselda poured the tea. Miss Marple accepted her cup with a murmur of thanks and looked out across the garden. A blackbird was tugging at something in the grass. The morning was so still that the sound of a cartwheel on the lane beyond the hedge carried clearly. "I think I shall come," Miss Marple said at last. "It would be pleasant to see the orchards again, and one does so enjoy a good harvest festival. All those jars of jam and the children's posies. Such innocent things, really." She said the word innocent the way another woman might say fragile. 2 days later, the little black Austin that belonged to the Clements carried Miss Marple along the narrow lane that wound between high hedges toward Little Folding. The sky was a pale, clear blue, and the air smelled of wood smoke and crushed leaves. As they crested the last rise, the village appeared below them, a scatter of thatched roofs, a squat stone church with a lich gate, and beyond it the long slope of the orchards heavy with fruit. The harvest festival was already underway on the green. Stalls had been set up under striped awnings. Women in printed frocks and cardigans stood behind tables of bottled fruit, honey and cakes. Children ran between the legs of the grown-ups with sticky fingers and loud voices. At the far end of the green, a long trestle table had been reserved for the apple competition. Rows of carefully polished fruit sat on white cloths, each tray labelled with a name and a number. Miss Marple was given a chair near the tea-urn by a helpful young woman from the Women's Institute. From there she could see almost everything without appearing to stare. She noted the faces, the sharp-featured Mrs. Harcourt in a fox fur tippet that looked too warm for the day, old Mr. Truscott, upright and weather-beaten, standing protectively near his own tray of deep red apples, the brother and sister from the old mill, he thin and dark-haired, she fairer and quieter, both of them a little apart from the rest. The judging began at 2:30. The young doctor from Market Basing, a pleasant-looking man with a mild manner, moved slowly along the table, lifting an apple now and then, smelling it, turning it in his hands. He spent a long time over the tray marked Old Mill, Golden Lenches. The fruit was unusual, elongated, pale gold, with a faint blush on one side. When he announced the winner, a small murmur ran through the crowd. The silver apple, an elegant little trophy no larger than a real fruit, was handed to the sister from the old mill. She accepted it, with a brief, almost embarrassed smile, and a quiet, "Thank you." Her brother did not smile at all. Mrs. Harcourt's mouth tightened. Old Mr. Truscott looked only thoughtful. Someone near the tea stall muttered that it was a pity the prize should go to people who hadn't even lived in the village a full year. The afternoon wore on in the usual pleasant way of such gatherings. There was a short service in the church. The children sang a harvest hymn, and then the green filled again with talk and the clink of teacups. Miss Marple remained in her chair, knitting a little, watching a little, speaking only when spoken to. It was nearly 5 o'clock when the first real disturbance came. A woman near the apple table gave a short, sharp cry. People turned. Old Mr. Truscott had taken one of the prize-winning golden lenches, offered, it seemed, by the sister herself as a gesture of goodwill, and bitten into it. He stood quite still for a moment, the apple in his hand, a puzzled look on his face. Then he made a small, choking sound, dropped the fruit, and put both hands to his throat. Someone caught him as he swayed. The young doctor was there in an instant. A space cleared. Voices rose and fell. The sister from the old mill stood frozen, the silver trophy still in her hands, her face the colour of paper. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. She did not push forward. She simply moved a little closer, her eyes moving from the fallen man to the half-eaten apple on the grass, to the faces of those who stood nearest. Mr. Truscott was carried into the church porch. The doctor worked quickly. After a few minutes he came out again, his expression carefully controlled. "He is alive," he said, "but only just. I believe he has been poisoned. We must get him to Market Basing at once." A silence fell over the green that was deeper than any silence the village had known that day. Miss Marple looked once more at the golden apple lying in the grass, its white flesh already beginning to brown where the bite had been taken. Then she looked at the sister from the old mill, still holding the silver prize as though she no longer knew what it was. Somewhere behind her, a child began to cry, and a woman said, very quietly, "But it was only an apple." Miss Marple folded her knitting and placed it carefully in her bag. "Yes," she said, almost to herself, "only an apple." But her eyes, mild and slightly faded behind their spectacles, had already begun to notice the small things that other people would overlook until it was too late. Chapter 2. The Shadow Under the Lich Gate. Night came early to Little Folding that evening. The mist that had clung to the orchards all afternoon thickened after sunset, turning the village green into a soft grey lake, and the church tower into a dark shape against a sky the colour of wet slate. Lamps were lit in cottage windows, and the smell of wood smoke drifted along the lanes, mingling with the sharper scent of fallen apples that no one had yet gathered. Miss Marple had been given a room at the vicarage. The vicar of Little Folding, a mild elderly man named Mr. Henshaw, and his sister Miss Henshaw, had insisted. "You mustn't think of driving back to St. Mary Mead in this fog," Miss Henshaw had said, her hands fluttering like nervous birds. And besides, after what had happened was already the only subject of conversation in every kitchen and parlour. Old Mr. Truscott lay in the cottage hospital at Market Basing. The young doctor, his name was Dr. Philip Langley, had telephoned just after 7 to say that the patient was still alive, though barely. The poison, he believed, was a strong dose of something that acted upon the heart and breathing. He would know more by morning. Miss Marple sat by the fire in the vicarage drawing-room, her knitting once more in her hands. The click of the needles was steady, almost soothing. Miss Henshaw hovered near the tea-table, unable to settle. The vicar paced between the fireplace and the window, pausing every few minutes to peer out into the mist, as though expecting further trouble to walk up the path. "It was the apple, of course," Miss Henshaw said for the 3rd time. "Everyone saw him take it. That girl from the old mill offered it to him. She said it was a gift, because he had congratulated her. And then, her voice trailed away. People will say a great many things before the night is out, Miss Marple observed quietly. They always do when something sudden and unpleasant occurs in a small place. It is human nature. One must try to separate what is said from what is known. The vicar stopped pacing. What is known, Miss Marple, is that a man nearly died after biting into an apple that came from the prize-winning tray. That tray belonged to the people at the old mill, and the silver trophy is still sitting on our hall table, because the young woman left it behind when the doctor took Mr. Truscott away. Miss Marple's needles paused. She left it behind? Yes. She looked quite dazed. Her brother took her arm and led her home almost at once. Neither of them has been seen since. A soft knock sounded at the front door. Miss Henshaw started so violently that she nearly upset the milk jug. The vicar went to answer it. Voices murmured in the hall, and a moment later Dr. Langley came into the room, his coat still damp from the mist, his face tired. "Forgive the intrusion," he said. "I wanted to speak to someone before I returned to Market Basing. Mr. Truscott is holding on. We have given him everything we can. The laboratory will test what remains of the apple tomorrow, but I am already certain it was deliberately poisoned. No ordinary orchard spray would produce such an effect so quickly." Miss Marple looked up. "Deliberately? You are quite sure?" "As sure as I can be without the full analysis. The bite was not large. Whatever was on or in that apple was concentrated." The doctor accepted a cup of tea and stood near the fire, warming his hands. "There is something else. When we carried Mr. Truscott into the church porch, I noticed a small cut on his lower lip, fresh and not from the apple itself. It was as though something sharp had caught him just before he bit down. I mention it only because it struck me as odd." Miss Marple's eyes, mild behind their spectacles, grew a fraction sharper. "A cut on the lip," she repeated softly. "How very interesting." After the doctor had gone, the vicarage settled into an uneasy quiet. Miss Henshaw went upstairs early. The vicar retreated to his study to write letters that would never be posted. Miss Marple remained by the fire a little longer, then rose, put on her coat and hat, and stepped quietly out into the night. The mist was thicker now. The village green was almost invisible. Only the church stood clear, its stone bulk rising above the fog like a ship at anchor. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the lich gate. She did not know precisely why her feet carried her there, only that the porch was where the stricken man had been laid, and that the first moments after a crime often left traces that daylight would erase. The lich gate itself was an old structure of oak and stone, its roof dark with age. Beneath it the air felt stiller, colder. Miss Marple stood for a moment, listening. Somewhere in the orchards an owl called once and was silent. Then she heard another sound, the soft scrape of a shoe on gravel. A figure detached itself from the deeper shadow beside the churchyard wall. It was a woman, slight, wearing a dark coat with the collar turned up. For an instant Miss Marple thought it might be the sister from the old mill. Then the figure stepped into the faint light that spilled from the church window, and she saw it was Mrs. Harcourt. The older woman stopped short when she recognized the visitor from St. Mary Mead. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and controlled. "I did not expect anyone else to be abroad at this hour." "Nor I," Miss Marple answered mildly. "The mist makes everything feel closer than it is, does it not? One almost fancies one can hear the apples falling in the dark." Mrs. Harcourt's gloved hands tightened on her handbag. "I came to see the porch. People are already saying dreadful things about that girl. I wanted to be certain nothing had been left behind that might be misunderstood." "And was anything left behind?" Mrs. Harcourt hesitated. Then she opened her bag and drew out a small white handkerchief, carefully folded. In its centre lay a single apple pip, brown and shining. "I found this on the step," she said. "Just one. It may mean nothing, but after what happened, I thought it better not to leave it for others to find and invent stories about." Miss Marple took the handkerchief gently and examined the pip under the weak light. It was ordinary enough, yet it had no business lying alone on the cold stone of the porch. "Thank you for showing it to me," she said. "It is always wise to notice the small things. They have a way of mattering later." Mrs. Harcourt gave a short nod, almost a bow, and walked away toward the manor without another word. Her footsteps faded quickly into the mist. Miss Marple remained under the lich gate a little longer. She looked once more at the pip, then folded the handkerchief and placed it carefully in her own bag. Somewhere beyond the churchyard wall, a dog barked, and a door closed with a hollow sound. When she returned to the vicarage, the fire had burned low. She sat again in the same chair, but she did not pick up her knitting. Instead, she stared into the embers, turning over in her mind the cut on an old man's lip, a single apple pip on cold stone, and the way Mrs. Harcourt's hands had trembled ever so slightly when she held out the handkerchief. Outside, the mist pressed against the windows. Inside, the only sound was the soft settling of ash in the grate. And in the quiet, Miss Marple began to understand that the harvest festival at Little Folding had not ended when the stalls were packed away. It had only just begun. Chapter 3. The House Among the Trees. Morning arrived slowly in Little Folding, as though the mist itself were reluctant to leave. By 8:30, a thin yellow light had begun to filter through the orchards, turning the wet grass to silver and making every spider's web along the hedgerows glitter like fine lace. The air still carried the sharp sweetness of bruised apples. Miss Marple breakfasted quietly with the Henshaws. Little was said. The vicar had received a further telephone message from the hospital. Mr. Truscott remained unconscious, but his heart was steadier. The laboratory results on the apple would not be ready until the afternoon. Until then, the village waited. After breakfast, Miss Marple put on her sturdy shoes, her tweed coat, and the soft felt hat she always wore in the country. She told Miss Henshaw she wished to take a short walk to clear her head. In truth, she had a destination firmly in mind. The lane to the old mill wound downhill from the church, past 3 cottages whose gardens were still heavy with late roses, then through a short stretch of woodland where the path became damp and soft underfoot. The mill itself stood in a small clearing beside a stream that had once turned the wheel. The wheel was long silent, green with moss, but the house attached to it had been carefully restored. Whitewashed walls, dark beams, and a garden that looked both productive and slightly wild. As Miss Marple approached the gate, she saw the sister from the old mill, hanging washing on a line, strung between 2 apple trees. The girl, she could not be more than 28, wore a plain brown dress and a knitted cardigan. Her fair hair was tied back with a ribbon that had seen better days. When she noticed the visitor, she grew very still, the wet sheet in her hands dripping unnoticed onto the grass. Miss Marple opened the gate and came forward with her usual gentle smile. "Good morning. I hope I am not disturbing you. My name is Jane Marple. I was at the festival yesterday. I wondered if I might speak with you for a few minutes." The young woman swallowed. "I'm Helen Varley. My brother is inside. He doesn't like callers just now." "I quite understand. Perhaps we might talk here in the garden, if that would be easier." Helen hesitated, then nodded and led the way to a wooden bench beneath one of the apple trees. The fruit hung thick above them, long, pale gold apples, the same variety that had won the silver trophy. A few had already fallen and lay in the grass, unmarked and ordinary. They sat. For a moment neither spoke. A blackbird scolded from the hedge. Somewhere inside the house a typewriter began to tap, stopped, then began again more slowly. "My brother is writing a book," Helen said at last, as though an explanation were required. "Historical novels. He works best when the house is quiet." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Yesterday must have been a great shock for you both." Helen's fingers twisted together. "Everyone thinks we did it. I can see it in their faces when they pass the gate. They look away. Or they don't look away, which is worse. I only offered Mr. Truscott the apple because he had been kind. He said our fruit was unusual and deserved the prize. I thought it was the proper thing to do. And the apple came from the tray that had been judged. Yes, directly from it. I chose one that looked perfect. I polished it on my sleeve first. I remember that." Her voice trembled slightly. I never left the table after the judging, not until he fell. Miss Marple's gaze moved thoughtfully over the trees. These are the golden lenches, are they not? An old variety. Not often seen now. Helen looked surprised. You know them? I have seen them once before, many years ago, in a garden in Kent. They are said to bruise rather easily, and to keep less well than a cox or a russet. Yet, they have a flavour all their own when they are at their best. My mother used to grow them, Helen said more quietly, in the West Country. When she died, my brother and I brought cuttings here. It was the only thing of hers we wanted to keep. The typewriter inside the house fell silent. A moment later, the back door opened, and a man stepped out. He was taller than his sister, thin, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face that looked as though it had not slept. He wore no jacket, only a shirt with the sleeves rolled, and his hands were stained with ink. "Helen," he said. His voice was low and even. "Who is this?" "Miss Marple, from St. Mary Mead. She was at the festival." The man, Richard Varley, studied the elderly visitor for a long moment. Then he gave a short nod, neither friendly nor unfriendly. "We have nothing to hide," he said, "but we also have nothing useful to tell. The apple was ours. My sister offered it in good faith. That is the whole of it." Miss Marple met his eyes without flinching. "Sometimes the whole of a thing is not visible at first glance, Mr. Varley. I have found that to be true more than once." He almost smiled. "Almost. You sound like a detective." "Oh dear me, no. I am only an old woman who has lived a long time in a small village. One sees patterns, that is all." Richard leaned against the door frame. "Then you will have noticed the pattern here already. 2 strangers win a prize that local people expected to keep among themselves. An old man falls ill after eating their fruit. Conclusion: the strangers are guilty." "It is neat. It is simple. It is also wrong." "I have not reached any conclusion," Miss Marple replied gently. "I have only begun to look." Helen stood up suddenly. "Would you like to see the storeroom where we kept the competition apples? Perhaps it will help." Her brother made a small sound of protest, but Helen had already started toward a low stone outbuilding beside the stream. Miss Marple followed. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of wood and fruit. Shelves lined the walls. Most were empty now. On one shelf lay a clean white cloth and a single empty tray. "This is where they were," Helen said. "I brought them out myself yesterday morning. No one else touched them until the judging." Miss Marple examined the room carefully. The single window with its simple latch, the door that closed with a solid wooden bar, the clean swept floor. Nothing appeared disturbed. Yet something about the empty tray held her attention. She reached out and ran one finger along its edge. A faint, almost invisible smear of something darker than dust came away on her skin. She said nothing of it. Instead, she thanked Helen, nodded to Richard, who still watched from the doorway, and took her leave. As she walked back up the lane, the mist had begun to lift in earnest. Sunlight reached the upper branches of the orchards. Behind her, the typewriter started again, the sound sharp and solitary in the quiet morning. Miss Marple walked slowly, turning the smear on her fingertip over in her mind. It was not dirt, it was not juice. It was something that did not belong in a clean storeroom of prize apples. And for the first time since the festival, she felt the faint, familiar stir of certainty that a pattern was beginning to form, though its true shape still lay hidden among the trees. Chapter 4. What the Doctor Would Not Say. By midday, the mist had lifted completely, and Little Folding lay under a pale autumn sun that made every leaf and window pane shine. Yet the village itself remained strangely hushed. Shop doors stood open, but conversation died whenever a stranger passed. Curtains moved in upstairs windows. People found reasons to walk past the churchyard and glance toward the porch where Mr. Truscott had fallen. Miss Marple returned to the vicarage to find Dr. Langley already there, standing in the hall with his hat in his hands. He looked as though he had not slept. The laboratory at Market Basing had telephoned an hour earlier. "The apple was coated," he told the vicar and Miss Marple in the drawing room. "Not injected, coated. A thin layer of something that dissolved quickly on the tongue and in the saliva. The chemists are still working to name it precisely, but it belongs to the same family as certain heart medicines that are rarely prescribed now. In a strong enough dose, it can stop the breath within minutes. Miss Henshaw, who had been hovering by the door, gave a small gasp and pressed a handkerchief to her lips. The doctor continued, his voice carefully level. There is more. The cut on Mr. Truscott's lip was not made by the apple's skin. The edges were too clean. Something sharp nicked him a moment before he bit down, perhaps a fragment of glass or a thin piece of metal that was fixed to the fruit and fell away when he opened his mouth. We found nothing of the sort in the grass, but the light was already failing by then. Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. You are telling us that the apple was prepared with some care. Yes, this was not a hasty act. The vicar rubbed a hand across his forehead. And the young woman from the old mill offered it with her own hands. People are already saying she must have known. Dr. Langley looked uncomfortable. I cannot speak to motive. I can only speak to what the body and the laboratory show. Mr. Truscott is stronger this morning. He has not spoken yet, but the nurses believe he may recover consciousness by evening. If he does, he may be able to tell us what he tasted or felt in those first seconds. After the doctor had gone, Miss Marple asked if she might borrow the vicarage bicycle. Miss Henshaw looked startled, but the machine was fetched from the shed, dusted, and declared safe enough for a careful rider. Miss Marple had not cycled in several years, yet the old skill returned easily enough. She set off along the lane that led toward Market Basing, the basket on the handlebars empty, the soft click of the chain keeping time with her thoughts. She did not go all the way to the town. Halfway along the road, she turned down a narrower track marked only by a weathered sign, Harcourt Manor, Private. The drive was long and well kept, lined with lime trees whose leaves were already thinning. The house itself was of grey stone, handsome but severe, with tall windows that reflected the sky. A maid answered the door and, after a short wait, showed Miss Marple into a morning room, where Mrs. Harcourt stood by the fireplace. The fox fur tippet of the day before had been replaced by a plain dark dress. She looked older in the stronger light. I wondered when you would come, Mrs. Harcourt said. She did not offer tea. You struck me as the sort of person who notices things other people prefer to leave alone. Miss Marple took the chair that was indicated. I try only to understand what I see. Yesterday evening you found an apple pip on the church porch. You were kind enough to show it to me. I have been wondering why you were there at all, so late and in such mist. Mrs. Harcourt's mouth tightened. For a moment, it seemed she would refuse to answer. Then she moved to the window and stood with her back to the room. I went because I was afraid, she said at last. Afraid that something of mine might be found and misinterpreted. Something of yours. A small silver fruit knife. It has a folding blade and a handle shaped like a leaf. It belonged to my husband. I carried it in my bag at the festival because I had used it earlier to cut samples from our own apples for the show. When the trouble began, I reached for my bag and the knife was gone. I searched the grass near the table, but the light was poor and people were pressing in. Later, I thought it might have fallen near the porch when they carried Mr. Truscott inside. That is why I went back. Miss Marple's hands rested quietly in her lap. And did you find the knife? No, only the pip. I have not found the knife since. Silence settled between them. Outside, a gardener moved slowly across the lawn with a wooden rake, the sound of his work soft and regular. Mr. Truscott and your husband were not on good terms, I believe, Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Harcourt turned. Her face had gone pale. Who told you that? No one needed to tell me. One hears the shape of old quarrels even when the words are left unspoken. In a village, the past is rarely far away. Mrs. Harcourt gave a short, bitter laugh. My husband accused Truscott of moving a boundary stone 20 years ago and taking a strip of orchard that belonged to the manor. Nothing was ever proved. The men stopped speaking. When my husband died, the silence continued. That is all. And yet you were at the festival, standing quite near the apple table when the prize was awarded. I was watching my own entry. Is that a crime? Of course not. Miss Marple rose. Thank you for telling me about the knife. It may matter, or it may not. One never knows until the end. She left the manor and cycled slowly back toward the village. The sun was lower now, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the road. As she passed the turning to the old mill, she glanced down the lane. No one was in sight, yet she had the distinct impression that a curtain in an upstairs window moved and then was still. At the vicarage a note was waiting for her, written in Dr. Langley's careful hand. Mr. Truscott opened his eyes at 3 o'clock. He has not spoken of the apple. He has spoken only one word, repeated twice, wrong. He would say nothing more, and has drifted again into sleep. I thought you should know. Miss Marple read the note twice. Then she folded it neatly and placed it in her bag beside the handkerchief that still held the single apple pip. Outside, the first leaves of evening began to fall, one by one, onto the quiet lawn. Chapter 5. The Word That Would Not Rest. Evening settled over Little Folding, with a stillness that felt heavier than the mist of the night before. Lamps were lit early. The smell of wood smoke rose from every chimney, and somewhere near the green, a single dog barked at nothing and then fell silent. In the vicarage drawing-room the fire had been built up, yet the warmth seemed unable to reach the corners of the room. Miss Marple sat with Dr. Langley's note open on her lap. She had read the single word again and again, wrong, until the letters themselves began to look strange. Miss Henshaw had gone upstairs with a headache. The vicar was in his study, turning the pages of a parish register without seeing them. The house felt as though it were holding its breath. At 7:15 the telephone rang. The vicar answered it and returned a moment later, his face grave. That was the hospital. Mr. Truscott is awake again. He is asking for the lady who was knitting near the tea-urn. He means you, Miss Marple. Dr. Langley says he is clear-headed for the moment, but they cannot say how long it will last. A car is being sent. The drive to Market Basing took 20 minutes through deepening dusk. The hospital was a low brick building on the edge of the town, its windows already glowing yellow. A nurse led Miss Marple along a quiet corridor that smelled of carbolic and beeswax. In a small side room, old Mr. Truscott lay propped against pillows, his weathered face the colour of parchment, his hands resting motionless on the coverlet. Dr. Langley stood at the foot of the bed. He insisted, the doctor murmured. "Only a few minutes, if you please." Miss Marple drew a chair close and sat. For a moment, the old man's eyes remained closed. Then they opened and found her face. "You were there," he said. His voice was thin, yet each word was clear. "I saw you, by the tea." "Yes," Miss Marple answered softly. "I was there." He drew a slow breath. "The apple. It tasted wrong. Not the fruit, something else. Bitter at the edge, and sharp. Cut my lip. I felt it. Can you tell me anything more?" Truscott's gaze drifted toward the window, where the last light was fading. "I thought it was kindness. The girl offered it. I had spoken well of her apples. I wanted to show there was no ill feeling about the prize. Pride is a foolish thing when a man is old." He paused, gathering strength. "But the taste was wrong, and the cut, like a thin blade, very fine." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Did you see anyone near the tray after the judging? Anyone who handled the apples besides the young woman?" The old man was silent for so long that Dr. Langley shifted uneasily. At last Truscott spoke again. "There was movement, people crowding. I was watching the silver apple being given. Then the girl was in front of me with the fruit in her hand. I took it. That is all I know." His eyes closed briefly, then opened once more. Tell them it was not the girl's doing. I do not believe it." Something else was at work. A nurse appeared at the door. Dr. Langley nodded. Miss Marple rose. "Thank you, Mr. Truscott," she said. "You have helped more than you know." Outside the room, the doctor walked with her toward the entrance. "He is weaker than he pretends," Langley said. "The poison did real damage. Even if he recovers, he will not be the man he was." He hesitated. "There is one other detail. When the nurses changed his shirt this afternoon, they found a small fragment of green leaf caught in the cuff. Not an apple leaf. Something smoother. I have sent it to the laboratory with the rest." Miss Marple filed the fact away without comment. The car returned her to Little Folding through a darkness broken only by the occasional glow of a cottage window. At the vicarage gate, she asked the driver to stop. Instead of going inside, she walked once more toward the church. The lich gate stood black against the sky. She stepped beneath it and remained there for several minutes, listening to the soft drip of moisture from the oak beams and the distant rustle of the orchards. When she turned to leave, a figure was waiting at the edge of the churchyard. Richard Varley, coat collar raised, hands in his pockets. "I heard they took you to the hospital," he said without greeting. "Did he speak?" "He spoke a little, and accused my sister, I suppose." "No," Miss Marple replied. "He did not." Something in the man's shoulders eased, though his face remained guarded. "People in this village have already decided." "They will not wait for proof. Helen cried for an hour after you left this morning. She thinks she will be arrested by nightfall." "No one has spoken of arrest yet," Miss Marple said. "But fear moves quickly in a small place. It is often more dangerous than evidence." Richard gave a short, humourless laugh. "Easy words from someone who can leave whenever she wishes. We cannot. This is the only home we have." He looked as though he might say more, then simply touched his hat and walked away toward the lane that led to the old mill. His footsteps faded into the dark. Miss Marple returned to the vicarage. The fire had burned low again. She sat beside it and took out the handkerchief that held the single apple pip, and beside it the note with the word "wrong." She placed them on the small table and looked at them for a long time. A cut made by a fine blade, a missing silver fruit knife shaped like a leaf, a smear of something dark on an empty tray, a fragment of green leaf that did not belong to an apple tree, and an old man who had tasted bitterness where there should have been only the clean sharpness of autumn fruit. Outside, a wind began to rise, moving through the orchards with a sound like distant whispering. Miss Marple reached for her knitting, but her fingers did not begin their work. She was listening instead to the pattern that was slowly, carefully revealing itself, one small, overlooked thing at a time. Chapter 6. The Knife That Was Not Lost. The wind that had risen in the night brought rain before dawn. By morning the orchards of Little Folding glistened under a steady grey sky, and the lanes ran with shallow streams of water that carried fallen leaves toward the lower fields. The village felt smaller somehow, drawn in upon itself, as though the weather had closed every unnecessary door. Miss Marple spent the early hours at the vicarage writing 2 short letters in her neat, old-fashioned hand. One was addressed to Colonel Melchett, the chief constable of the county, the other to her old friend Sir Henry Clithering, retired from Scotland Yard and living now in quiet comfort some 30 miles away. She did not explain her reasons to the Henshaws. She merely asked that the letters be posted when someone next went into Market Basing. At 10 o'clock, she set out on foot for the manor once more. The rain had eased to a fine drizzle that beaded on her coat and the brim of her hat. She walked without hurry, noticing how the ditches ran full and how the hips on the wild rose bushes shone like drops of blood against the wet green. Mrs. Harcourt received her in the same morning room as before, but today a fire burned in the grate, and a tray of coffee had been set out. The older woman looked as though she had slept little. "I have been expecting you," she said. "News travels quickly when an old man speaks from his hospital bed." Miss Marple accepted a cup of coffee and sat. Mr. Truscott remembered the taste of the apple and the cut upon his lip. He also remembered that the fruit was offered in what he believed was kindness. "He does not accuse Helen Varley." Mrs. Harcourt's hands tightened around her own cup. "Then whom does he accuse?" "He does not know. That is why the rest of us must continue to look." Miss Marple set her cup down carefully. "You told me yesterday that your silver fruit knife disappeared during the festival. I wonder whether you would describe it to me again, more precisely this time." A flicker of irritation crossed Mrs. Harcourt's face, then faded. "It is small enough to fit in the palm. The handle is silver, shaped like a beech leaf, slightly curved. The blade folds into it and is no longer than my little finger. My husband had it made in London the year before he died. He used it for tasting fruit in the orchard. After his death, I kept it in my bag out of habit more than need." And you are certain it was in your bag when you arrived at the green? Certain. I had used it that morning to cut a russet for my own judgment. I wiped the blade, folded it, and returned it to the side pocket. Miss Marple nodded slowly. A knife so distinctive would be noticed if it were found, yet no one has reported it. Mrs. Harcourt rose and walked to the writing desk beneath the window. From a drawer she took a small velvet box and opened it. Inside, on a bed of faded silk, lay a second silver knife, almost identical, though the leaf was oak rather than beech. "My husband ordered 2, she said. "One for himself, one as a gift for the man who managed the orchards in those days. That man left our employ 15 years ago and took the gift with him. I have never seen it since. I show you this only so you will understand exactly what is missing." Miss Marple examined the knife without touching it. The workmanship was fine, the blade still keen. She closed the box gently. "Who managed the orchards then?" "A man named Alfred Gerard. He quarrelled with my husband over wages and the boundary stone that later caused so much trouble with Truscott. He left the district. I heard he went north. That is all I know." The rain strengthened against the windows. Somewhere in the house a clock struck the half-hour. Miss Marple stood. "Thank you. You have been clearer today than yesterday. Clarity is always useful." She left the manor and walked back through the drizzle toward the village. Instead of returning to the vicarage, she turned down the short track that led to the small row of tied cottages behind the church. The end cottage belonged to the woman who had served tea at the festival, Mrs. Elsie Boone, a widow of long standing and a reliable source of the kind of knowledge that never appeared in official reports. Mrs. Boone opened the door with flour on her hands and a guarded expression that softened when she recognized her visitor. "Miss Marple, come in out of the wet. I was just making scones for the vicar's sister." The kitchen was warm and smelled of baking. Miss Marple sat at the scrubbed table while Mrs. Boone brushed flour from her forearms. "I won't keep you long," Miss Marple said. "I am trying to remember the faces near the apple table when the prize was given. You were pouring tea only a few yards away. Did you notice anyone handling the fruit after the judging, anyone who did not belong there?" Mrs. Boone considered, wiping her hands on her apron. Most people were watching the silver apple being handed over. There was a bit of a press, the way there always is. I saw Mrs. Harcourt standing stiff as a poker. I saw old Truscott smiling for once. And I saw that writer from the old mill, the brother, move up close behind his sister just as she picked the apple to offer. He said something in her ear. She shook her head. Then Truscott took the fruit and, well, the brother spoke to her. Yes, quiet-like. Couldn't hear the words, but she looked startled for a second, then went ahead and held the apple out anyway. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the flour-dusted table. "One other thing, Mrs. Boone. Do you remember a man named Alfred Gerard who once worked at the manor?" The change in the other woman's face was immediate. "Gerard? Bless me, there's a name I haven't heard in years. Yes, he was head orchard man until he and the old Mr. Harcourt fell out. Bad business. Gerard claimed he'd been promised a cottage and a strip of land. Never got either. He left with hard words on both sides." "Why do you ask?" "Curiosity only," Miss Marple said mildly. "In a village, the past has a way of walking into the present without wiping its feet." She thanked Mrs. Boone and walked back to the vicarage through rain that had grown colder. In the drawing room, she found a telegram had arrived for her. It was from Sir Henry Clithering and contained only one line: "Gerard alive. Living under the name Marsh in a village 7 miles north of you. Am coming." Miss Marple folded the telegram and placed it with the other small pieces of paper she carried. The note from the doctor, the handkerchief with the pip. Outside, the rain fell steadily on the orchards, washing the last of the festival from the grass, yet unable to wash away the quiet, careful work of someone who had prepared an apple with a thin blade and a bitter coating, while an entire village looked the other way. Chapter 7. The Man Who Changed His Name. The rain continued through the afternoon, soft and unrelenting, turning the lanes of Little Folding into quiet streams of brown water. Miss Marple remained at the vicarage, her knitting untouched on the table beside her. She had read Sir Henry's telegram 3 times and then placed it carefully with the other small pieces of evidence she carried. The name Marsh meant nothing to her yet, but the fact that Alfred Gerard still lived only 7 miles away meant a great deal. At 4 o'clock, a large, old-fashioned car drew up outside the vicarage gate. Sir Henry Clithering stepped out, shook the rain from his hat, and came up the path with the steady walk of a man who had once commanded attention in every police station in London and now preferred the quieter authority of experience. The Henshaws received him with the mixture of respect and mild awe that his reputation still produced. Miss Marple simply smiled, as though an expected guest had arrived for tea. They spoke privately in the drawing-room once the door was closed. "Gerard left the Harcourt employ 15 years ago," Sir Henry said without preamble. "He moved north, worked in several orchards, and finally settled in the village of Holbrook under the name Thomas Marsh. He keeps a small nursery there, apples, pears, and a few experimental varieties. No criminal record, no known contact with Little Folding until 3 weeks ago." Miss Marple looked up. 3 weeks ago? He was seen in Market Basing on market day. A nurseryman who supplies the local greengrocers recognised him and mentioned it to a constable who happens to be my godson. The constable thought it odd enough to note. Gerard, or Marsh, bought nothing of consequence, spoke to no one for long, and left before noon. "That is all we have. It is enough to begin with," Miss Marple said. They drove to Holbrook in Sir Henry's car as the light began to fade. The village was smaller than Little Folding, little more than a single street, a church, and a scatter of houses set among wet fields. The nursery stood at the far end, behind a low brick wall and a painted sign that read T. Marsh, Fruit Trees and Scions. A man was moving between the rows of young trees, a sack across his shoulders, when they arrived. He was in his middle 60s, broad-shouldered still, with a weathered face and eyes the colour of wet slate. When he saw the car, he set the sack down and waited. Sir Henry performed the introductions with careful politeness. "Mr. Marsh, or do you prefer the name you used when you worked at Harcourt Manor?" The man did not pretend surprise. He wiped his hands on his trousers and nodded once. "Gerard will do. I stopped hiding the name years ago. People who care already know. People who don't need not trouble themselves." His gaze moved to Miss Marple and remained there a moment longer than necessary. "You're the lady from the festival. News reaches even here. May we speak under shelter?" Miss Marple asked. "The rain is persistent." Gerard led them into a potting shed that smelled of damp earth and wood shavings. A single oil lamp burned on a shelf. He did not offer them seats. There were none to offer. "I heard about Truscott," he said. "I am sorry for it. He and I were never friends, but I never wished him harm." Sir Henry watched him closely. "You were in Market Basing 3 weeks ago." "I was. I go every month for supplies I cannot grow myself. Is that now a crime?" "No. But your former employer's widow is missing a silver fruit knife that once had a twin. The twin was given to you when you managed the Harcourt orchards." Gerard's expression did not change, yet something in the set of his shoulders hardened. He reached into the pocket of his coat, drew out a small object wrapped in an old handkerchief, and laid it on the wooden bench between them. When he unfolded the cloth, the silver knife with the oak leaf handle lay gleaming in the lamplight. "I have kept it," he said, "not out of fondness, out of memory. Harcourt promised me a cottage and a strip of the lower orchard if I stayed 10 years and improved the stock. I stayed 12. When I asked for what was promised, he laughed and said verbal agreements were worth nothing. I left the next week. The knife was the only thing of his I took with me, and it had been a gift. I have never used it for anything but cutting scions." Miss Marple examined the knife without touching it. The blade was clean and sharp. The silver leaf was identical in workmanship to the one Mrs. Harcourt had shown her, only the shape of the leaf differed. "Have you been in Little Folding itself in recent weeks?" she asked. "No." "And you have had no contact with anyone there?" Gerard hesitated. The oil lamp flickered. "I wrote one letter, 3 weeks ago, after I heard the Harvest Festival would include an open apple competition for the first time in years. I wrote to Richard Varley at the old mill, Sir Henry's eyebrows rose slightly. Why Varley? Because I knew what trees he had planted. Golden lenches, rare now. I propagated them myself 30 years ago from stock that came out of the West Country. When I left the manor, I took a few cuttings, quietly. Later, I sold scions to a grower in Devon. That grower's daughter married, moved, and eventually the trees ended with the Varleys. I wrote to tell the young man the true history of his fruit and to warn him that certain people in Little Folding still regard those trees as stolen property. I thought he deserved to know before he entered them for a prize. Did he reply? Miss Marple asked. He did not. Rain beat more heavily on the shed roof. Gerard wrapped the knife again and returned it to his pocket. I did not poison any apple, he said. I have no cause against Truscott that would make me do such a thing, and I have never met the Varley girl. You may search this place if you wish. You will find only trees. Sir Henry nodded slowly. We may need to speak again. I will be here, Gerard answered. I have nowhere else to go. The drive back to Little Folding was quiet. Sir Henry kept his eyes on the wet road. Miss Marple watched the dark shapes of the hedges slip past the windows. He is telling the truth about the knife, she said at last. But truth, Sir Henry, is sometimes arranged in layers. One may speak quite honestly about one layer, while another remains hidden underneath. Sir Henry glanced at her. You think he is involved? I think, Miss Marple replied, that a man who once took cuttings in silence and waited 30 years to write a letter about them is a man who understands the long patience of orchards and of grievances. Whether that patience has borne a different kind of fruit is what we have still to discover. When they reached the vicarage, the rain had finally begun to ease. In the drawing-room, a note waited on the table, delivered by hand from the hospital. Mr. Truscott had spoken one more time before falling again into sleep. The words were short. The blade was cold. Chapter 8. The Cold Blade. The words, "The blade was cold," lay on the vicarage table like a small stone dropped into still water. Miss Marple read them once more by the light of the lamp, then folded the hospital note and placed it with the others she kept so carefully. Sir Henry Clithering stood by the fireplace, turning his hat slowly in his hands. Truscott is a dying man, he said. The doctors give him no more than a day or two. Whatever he still remembers, we must use quickly. Miss Marple nodded. A cold blade, not the warmth of a hand that has held a knife for some time, a blade that had been lying still, perhaps hidden, until the moment it was needed. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the last of the rain dripping from the eaves. Then Miss Marple rose. I should like to visit the old mill again, she said. Tonight, if Mr. Varley will receive us. There are questions that have waited long enough. Sir Henry drove. The lane was dark and the puddles deep. When they reached the mill house, only one window showed light, an upstairs room where a lamp burned behind thin curtains. Richard Varley opened the door himself. He looked as though he had aged a year in 2 days. Behind him, in the narrow hall, Helen stood with her arms folded tightly across her cardigan. You had better come in, Richard said. The village has already decided we are not to be left in peace. They sat in the low-ceilinged parlour. A fire of applewood burned in the grate, sweet and smoky. Helen remained standing near the door, as if ready to leave the room at the first hard word. Miss Marple spoke gently. Mr. Truscott has remembered that the blade which cut his lip was cold. That suggests it had not been held in a warm hand for long. Mrs. Boone, who served tea only a few yards from the apple table, saw you step close to your sister, just as she chose the fruit to offer. You spoke to her. She looked startled, yet she continued. Richard's mouth tightened. I told her not to offer it. I said it would look like pride, winners giving away their own prize fruit. I told her to wait. She shook her head and did it anyway. That is all. Is it? Sir Henry asked quietly. Helen's voice came from the doorway, thin but clear. Richard is telling the truth. He did not want me to give the apple. I thought he was being ungracious. I wanted to show we were not triumphant. I chose the best-looking one from the tray and held it out. Mr. Truscott took it. I never felt any knife. I never saw any knife. Miss Marple watched her face. "The storeroom where the apples waited before the festival. When did you last leave it unlocked?" "I didn't," Helen said. "I locked it myself the night before. The key stayed in my apron pocket until morning." "And the key was with you all that time?" Helen's eyes flickered toward her brother, then away. "I hung the apron on the chair in the kitchen when I went up to bed. The key was still in the pocket." Richard made a small sound of impatience. "Anyone could have taken it in the night if they knew where to look. We do not live in a fortress." Sir Henry leaned forward. "Did either of you receive a letter some 3 weeks ago from a man named Thomas Marsh or Alfred Gerard?" The change in Richard's face was immediate and unguarded. He stood up, walked to a desk in the corner, and returned with a single sheet of paper, folded and refolded many times. "I received it," he said. "I did not show it to Helen. I thought it was the work of a bitter old man trying to make trouble. He claimed our golden lenches were descended from cuttings he had taken from Harcourt ground years ago. He said certain people still considered the trees stolen. I burned the envelope and kept the letter only because the history of the fruit interested me as a writer. I never answered it." Miss Marple held out her hand. Richard gave her the letter. The handwriting was strong and even. The warning was plain. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, Gerard had written, "The past has a long reach in orchard country. Be careful who you trust with the fruit of it." Helen had come closer. She read the letter over Miss Marple's shoulder and then looked at her brother with something close to anger. "You kept this from me, while people were already whispering that we did not belong here." "I was trying to protect you," Richard said, "by leaving me ignorant." Sir Henry cleared his throat. "Protecting one another is understandable. Concealing a warning that touches directly on the fruit that later poisoned a man is less so." Richard's hands clenched. "I did not poison anyone. Neither did Helen. That letter made me cautious, nothing more. I watched the tray more carefully than I might have done. That is why I stood near my sister at the end. I was afraid someone might try to spoil what we had won, not by poison but by spite. A bruise on the best apple, a quiet substitution. Village tricks. I never imagined anything worse." Miss Marple returned the letter. "Yet something worse occurred, and the blade that cut Mr. Truscott's lip was cold, suggesting it had been placed ready, not carried about all afternoon in a warm pocket." She rose. "One last question. The smear I found on the edge of your empty tray in the storeroom, dark, thin, not juice and not dirt. Do either of you know what it was?" Helen shook her head at once. Richard frowned. "I cleaned that tray myself the morning of the festival," he said. "There was nothing on it." Miss Marple regarded him for a long moment. "Then someone else touched it after you did." They left the old mill soon afterward. The rain had stopped, and a thin moon showed between drifting clouds. In the car, Sir Henry spoke first. "They are frightened, but fear is not the same as guilt." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Yet the letter was real. The warning was real. And someone who knew the history of those trees also knew the history of the silver knives. 2 blades cut from the same design, one kept by the widow, one carried away by the orchard man who felt cheated. Now one of them is missing, and an old man is dying with the memory of a cold edge against his lip." She looked out at the dark shape of the church tower rising above the trees. "Tomorrow," she said, "I think we must speak again with Mrs. Harcourt, and this time we must ask her what she truly did with the knife she claims she lost." Chapter 9. The Second Knife. Morning came clear and cold. The rain had washed the last of the festival from the village green, leaving only trampled grass and a few forgotten apple leaves stuck to the wooden trestles that still stood against the church wall. In the vicarage, Sir Henry Clithering breakfasted early and then walked to the post office to telephone the hospital. He returned with a grave face. "Truscott died just before dawn," he told Miss Marple. "Peacefully," the nurse said. He did not speak again. Miss Marple received the news with a quiet inclination of her head. "Then we must finish what he began for us." They drove to Harcourt Manor, while the grass was still silver with dew. Mrs. Harcourt received them in the morning room, dressed in black, her face composed into the careful mask of a woman who had already decided how much she would say. Sir Henry placed the oak leaf knife, Gerard's knife, on the table between them. "We have spoken with Alfred Gerard," he said. "He still has the gift your husband gave him. The beech leaf knife remains missing." Mr. Truscott's final clear memory was of a cold blade against his lip. "We are here to ask you once more what became of yours." Mrs. Harcourt looked at the silver knife on the table for a long time. Then she rose, unlocked a small drawer in the writing desk, and took out a folded square of dark cloth. She opened it. Inside lay the beech leaf knife, its blade clean, its silver handle dull from recent handling. "I lied," she said simply. "I never lost it." Miss Marple showed no surprise. "Will you tell us why you said you had?" Mrs. Harcourt returned to her chair. Her hands, usually so steady, rested flat upon her knees, as though to keep them from trembling. "Because I used it," she said. "Not to poison anyone. To protect something I believed was mine." She drew a slow breath. 3 weeks ago, I learned that the Varleys intended to enter Golden Lenches in the competition. I knew those trees. My husband had spoken of them with anger for years. Cuttings taken from our ground by Gerard when he left. When I heard the Varleys had them, I wrote to Gerard myself. I asked if the trees were truly from our stock. He replied that they were. He also told me he had written to Richard Varley with the same information. Sir Henry's eyes narrowed. "You did not mention this letter before." "No. I was ashamed of my own bitterness. On the morning of the festival I took my knife with me, as I always did. After the judging, when the silver trophy was given to that girl, I felt something I am not proud of. I moved close to the tray, while people were watching the presentation. I intended only to mark one of the remaining apples. A small cut, nothing more, so that if they were displayed later everyone would see they were imperfect. A petty, spiteful act. I had the knife open in my hand, hidden by my bag. Then the girl picked up the very apple I had reached toward and offered it to Truscott. I closed the knife at once and stepped back. I never touched the fruit." Miss Marple regarded her steadily. "Yet the blade that cut Mr. Truscott was cold. A knife held in a warm hand for even a minute would not feel so." Mrs. Harcourt's voice dropped. "I had not held it long. I took it from my bag only when the prize was announced. It had lain there all afternoon. It would still have been cold." "And afterward?" Sir Henry asked. "Why claim it was lost?" "Because I was afraid. When Truscott fell, I realized how it would look if anyone had seen the knife in my hand. I went back to the porch that night to make certain I had not dropped it in the confusion. I found only the pip. I kept the knife hidden and told the story of its loss, so that no one would search me for it." She looked from one to the other. "I did not coat any apple with poison. I did not wish Truscott dead. Our old quarrel was about a boundary stone and pride, nothing more. I have told you the truth now, late though it is." Miss Marple was silent for a moment. Then she said, "The smear on the Varley's tray, dark and thin. If you never touched the fruit, you will not know what it was." "I know nothing of any smear." They left her soon afterward. In the car, Sir Henry spoke first. "She is telling the truth about the knife. The rest may be another layer." Miss Marple watched the wet fields pass. She intended a small cruelty and found herself standing at the edge of a greater one. That much I believe. Yet someone else came prepared with poison and with the knowledge of exactly which apple would be offered. They returned to the village as the church clock struck 11. On the green, a small group of women stood talking in low voices near the empty trestles. When they saw Miss Marple, they fell silent and looked away. Fear, once planted, grows quickly in narrow lanes. At the vicarage, a second telegram had arrived, this one from Colonel Melchett. The laboratory had identified the poison, a concentrated extract of foxglove leaves, prepared with care and applied in a thin coating that would dissolve at the first bite. The fragment of green leaf found in Truscott's cuff matched the same plant. Miss Marple read the message twice. Then she went to the window and looked out toward the orchards that rose beyond the church. "Foxglove," she said softly, "a plant that grows in every woodland edge around this village. Easy to gather, easy to prepare if one knows how, and easy to hide among the leaves of an apple tree until the moment it is needed. Sir Henry came to stand beside her. Who in Little Folding would know how to prepare such a thing? Miss Marple's answer was almost too quiet to hear. Someone who has lived long enough among these trees to understand both their gifts and their quiet dangers. Someone who watched an old grievance ripen year after year, the way an orchard watches its fruit. And someone who decided, at last, that this harvest would be different from all the others. She turned from the window. "I think," she said, "it is time we asked the Varleys to show us every corner of the old mill, especially the places where foxgloves might have been dried and kept." Chapter 10. Where the foxgloves grew. The old mill looked different in the hard light of late morning. The stream ran clearer after the rain, and the moss on the silent wheel shone a vivid green. Richard Varley met them at the gate. He had been expecting the visit. The set of his shoulders said as much. Helen stood a little behind him, her face pale but composed. "You may search wherever you wish," Richard said. "We have nothing left to hide that matters." Sir Henry Clithering and Miss Marple began with the storeroom. The empty tray still stood on the shelf. In daylight, the dark smear Miss Marple had noticed was barely visible. Yet, when she touched it again with a clean handkerchief, a faint greenish-brown trace remained. Sir Henry sealed the cloth in an envelope. They moved through the house methodically. The kitchen was plain and clean. Upstairs, the 2 bedrooms held little beyond books, clothes, and the tools of Richard's writing, stacks of manuscript paper, a worn typewriter, bottles of ink. No dried herbs hung from the rafters. No jars of strange powders stood in cupboards. It was Helen who finally spoke, her voice low. "If you are looking for foxgloves, they grow behind the orchard wall. They always have. I never thought about them until the doctor's message came this morning. Everyone in the village knows they are poisonous. Children are warned against them every summer." She led them out through the back garden, past the washing line and the rows of apple trees, to a low stone wall that bordered a strip of rough ground. There the foxgloves stood, tall, rain-beaten spikes with a few late blossoms still clinging, their leaves dark and plentiful. Several stems had been cut cleanly near the base, and recently, Miss Marple knelt and examined the cuts. These were taken within the last fortnight. The stems have not yet fully browned. Richard's face darkened. Anyone could have walked through here. The wall is low. We do not patrol the orchard at night. Sir Henry looked at him. "Yet the letter from Gerard warned you that the past had a long reach. Did you never think to watch more carefully?" "I watched the apples," Richard said. "I never imagined someone would use our own ground against us." They returned to the house. In the parlour, Miss Marple sat once more in the chair she had occupied the night before. She looked from brother to sister with the mild, steady gaze that had unsettled so many people over the years. "There is something I must ask you both," she said. "When you first came to the old mill at Easter, did you know the history of the golden lenches? Did you know they were tied to an old quarrel between the Harcourts and the man who once managed their orchards?" Helen answered first. "No. We knew only that our mother had loved the variety. She grew them in Devon from stock she bought from a nursery. When she died, we brought cuttings here because they reminded us of her. That is the whole truth." Richard was slower to speak. "I learned the rest from Gerard's letter. Until then I thought only that we had planted something unusual. I did not know we had planted a grievance." Miss Marple nodded. "And yet the poison was prepared from foxgloves that grow on your ground. The apple that carried it came from your tray. The blade that cut Mr. Truscott's lip was of a design connected to the same old quarrel. Every thread leads back to these trees and to the people who claim them." Helen's eyes filled, but she did not look away. "Then someone is using us. Someone who knows the history better than we do." A silence settled over the room. Outside, a light wind moved through the apple branches, and a single late fruit fell with a soft thud into the grass. Sir Henry cleared his throat. "We will need to speak with Gerard again, and with Mrs. Harcourt. The laboratory will test the smear from the tray. Until then, I must ask you both to remain here in the village." Richard gave a short, bitter laugh. "Where else would we go? The doors of every cottage are already closed against us." They left the old mill soon after. On the lane back to the village, Miss Marple asked Sir Henry to stop the car near the church. She stepped out and walked once more beneath the lich gate, standing in the same place where Mrs. Harcourt had appeared on the night of the mist. The stone step was clean now, no pip lay there, yet she remained for several minutes, her eyes half closed, as though listening for something the living could no longer hear. When she returned to the car, she said, "The cut on the lip was deliberate, not an accident of a spiteful nick. Someone fixed a small, sharp edge to the apple, so that the poison would enter the blood more quickly. That is why the blade felt cold. It had been prepared and left ready, not carried about." Sir Henry stared at her. Fixed how? A thin sliver of metal, perhaps, or a fragment of a blade, held in place by the same sticky coating that carried the poison. When Truscott bit down, the edge did its work and fell away into the grass. In the confusion, no one found it. She looked toward the orchards that rose beyond the churchyard. "We have been looking for a missing knife," she said. "Perhaps we should have been looking for the piece that was broken from one." At the vicarage, a message was waiting from Colonel Melchett. The smear on the handkerchief had been tested. It contained the same foxglove extract that had killed Mr. Truscott, diluted, as though a prepared apple had rested briefly against the edge of the tray before being returned to its place. Miss Marple read the note and then folded it away. "Someone handled that apple in the storeroom," she said, "after Richard cleaned the tray and before Helen carried the fruit to the festival. Someone who knew exactly which apple would be offered as a gesture of goodwill." She sat down beside the fire, her hands quiet in her lap. "The pattern is almost complete," she said softly. "One more conversation, I think, and we shall see the whole of it." Chapter 11. The Piece That Was Broken. The day of Mr. Truscott's funeral was cold and bright. The sky above Little Folding had the hard, polished look of china, and the wind moved through the orchards with a dry, restless sound. Almost the entire village walked behind the coffin, from the church to the small plot beneath the yew trees where generations of Truscotts already lay. Miss Marple stood a little apart, her black coat buttoned to the throat, her eyes moving quietly over the faces around the open grave. Mrs. Harcourt stood rigid among the mourners. Richard and Helen Varley remained at the back, unwanted yet unwilling to stay away. Alfred Gerard had come from Holbrook and stood alone beneath the churchyard wall, his hat in his hands. When the earth struck the coffin lid, he turned and walked away without speaking to anyone. After the service, the village dispersed slowly. Miss Marple asked Sir Henry to drive her first to the manor, then to the old mill, and finally to the small cottage, where Mrs. Boone was already changing out of her funeral black. By 4 o'clock, the three of them, Miss Marple, Sir Henry, and Colonel Melchett, who had arrived from the county town, were gathered once more in the vicarage drawing-room. The pieces lay on the table between them, like the parts of a clock waiting to be set in motion. Miss Marple spoke first. "We have a poison prepared from foxgloves that grow behind the old mill wall. We have an apple from the Varleys' tray that carried that poison. We have a cold blade that cut Mr. Truscott's lip so the poison would work more quickly. We have 2 silver knives of the same design, one kept by Mrs. Harcourt, one by Alfred Gerard. And we have a smear of the same poison on the tray in the storeroom, left after Richard Varley cleaned it and before Helen carried the fruit to the green." Colonel Melchett frowned. "Which still leaves us with too many people who had reason to dislike either Truscott or the Varleys." "Reason is not the same as opportunity," Miss Marple said, "and opportunity is not the same as the particular knowledge required. Someone had to know that Helen Varley would offer an apple as a gesture of goodwill. Someone had to know which apple she was likely to choose, the finest-looking one that remained. Someone had to have access to the storeroom key while it hung in an apron pocket overnight, and someone had to possess, or obtain, a thin, sharp fragment of metal that could be fixed to the fruit with the same sticky coating that carried the poison." She paused, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. Mrs. Harcourt admitted she intended a petty cut with her own knife, but she stepped back when Helen chose the apple. Her knife is whole. Gerard's knife is whole. Yet Mr. Truscott felt a cold edge. Therefore the blade that cut him was not a complete knife. It was a piece broken from one. Sir Henry looked up sharply. Broken from which? From neither of the two we have seen. There was a third. The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind rattled a loose latch somewhere in the house. Miss Marple continued. When Mr. Harcourt ordered the 2 silver fruit knives, he was a man who liked things in pairs and sets. It would have been characteristic of him to order a third, perhaps a smaller one, or one with a different leaf, as a gift for someone else entirely, someone who stood closer to him than the orchard manager, someone who might have kept it all these years without speaking of it. Colonel Melchett leaned forward. Who? Miss Marple's voice remained mild. The boundary stone that caused the old quarrel between Harcourt and Truscott was moved, or was said to have been moved, 20 years ago. The man who surveyed the ground and wrote the report that settled the dispute in Harcourt's favour was the village schoolmaster at the time, a careful, precise man who has lived quietly in Little Folding ever since. His name is Mr. Lewis Adair. He is retired now. He keeps a small garden behind the schoolhouse, and in that garden, among the asters and the late roses, foxgloves grow in abundance. Sir Henry sat very still. Adair, he was at the festival, Miss Marple said. He stood near the tea-urn for a long time. He is the sort of man no one notices once he has grown old. He knew the history of the golden lenches because he had written the original report that described the orchard boundaries. He knew Gerard had taken cuttings. He knew Mrs. Harcourt still nursed the grievance. And he knew that Helen Varley, new to the village and eager to be accepted, would offer the prize fruit as a peace-making gesture. She folded her hands. The night before the festival, the key to the storeroom hung in Helen's apron on a kitchen chair. Adair had visited the old mill earlier that week to welcome the newcomers, as an old schoolmaster might. He would have seen the apron. He would have known the layout of the place. He prepared the apple in the dark, fixed a thin sliver broken from his own small silver knife, and returned the fruit to the tray. The smear was left when the sticky coating touched the wood. The next day he had only to wait. Colonel Melchett's face had grown stern. Motive? Miss Marple looked toward the window, where the first shadows of evening were beginning to stretch across the lawn. 20 years ago, Mr. Adair's report gave the disputed strip of orchard to the Harcourts. Truscott never forgave it. In the years that followed, he made certain that Adair's life in the village was quietly uncomfortable. Remarks in the pub, delayed repairs to the schoolhouse roof, a word in the right ear when Adair applied for a small pension increase. Nothing dramatic. Just the slow, steady pressure that a proud man can exert on a quieter one. Adair endured it. Then the Varleys arrived with the very trees that had stood at the heart of the old dispute, and the harvest festival offered a stage. He decided that if the past was to be revived, it would end on his terms. She rose. The broken piece of the third knife will still be somewhere near the church porch or the green, unless he has since retrieved it. And in Mr. Adair's cottage I believe you will find the remaining handle, silver, shaped like a hawthorn leaf, and the small dishes in which he prepared the foxglove extract. Colonel Melchett stood as well. Then we had better pay him a visit before the light goes. Miss Marple nodded once. Yes, she said. The harvest is over. It is time the last apple was brought in. Chapter 12. The Last Apple. The light was already failing when Colonel Melchett, Sir Henry Clithering, and 2 constables walked up the short path to the former schoolhouse. Miss Marple came a little behind them, her steps unhurried. The cottage was small and neat, its windows glowing with the soft yellow of a single lamp. In the front garden, the last foxgloves stood black against the dusk, their seed heads rattling whenever the wind touched them. Mr. Lewis Adair opened the door himself. He was a slight man of 70, with careful grey hair and the precise posture of someone who had spent a lifetime requiring children to sit up straight. When he saw the uniforms, his face did not change, yet something behind the eyes settled, as though a long calculation had finally reached its answer. "I have been expecting you," he said. "Please come in." The parlour was sparsely furnished and very clean. On the mantelpiece stood a small silver object, no larger than a child's finger, the handle of a fruit knife, shaped like a hawthorn leaf, the blade long since broken away. Beside it lay a shallow saucer that still held a faint greenish stain. Colonel Melchett spoke the formal words. Adair listened without interruption. Then he nodded once. "I will not waste your time with denials," he said. "The apple was prepared in the storeroom of the old mill the night before the festival. The key was where any observant visitor might notice it. I chose the finest fruit that remained, coated it, and fixed the broken edge of my old knife so that the first bite would do more than taste bitter. I returned the apple to its place and left. The next afternoon, I stood near the tea table and watched. Sir Henry's voice was quiet. "Why Truscott?" Adair looked toward the dark window. "Because for 20 years he made certain I remembered the boundary report I had written. He never raised his voice. He simply arranged that life became a little harder, year after year. When the Varleys planted those golden lenches, the very trees that had stood on the disputed ground, I saw the past opening again like a door one thought had been locked. The festival gave me a stage and a method. I took both." Miss Marple had remained near the doorway. Now she spoke, her tone mild yet clear. "You meant the girl to be blamed." Adair inclined his head. "I meant the quarrel to end. If the village believed the newcomers had poisoned an old man out of pride, the trees would be cut down, the Varleys would leave, and the old wound would close. I did not foresee that Truscott would live long enough to speak of a cold blade, or that an elderly visitor from another village would notice a single pip and a smear of green on a wooden tray." He looked at Miss Marple then, almost with curiosity. "You see the small things," he said. "Most people do not." "I have had a great deal of practice," she answered. The constables led him out. He walked between them without resistance, pausing only once at the gate to look back at the foxgloves. Then he was gone, and the cottage stood empty under the darkening sky. Later that evening, the vicarage drawing-room was quiet. Sir Henry sat with a glass of whisky. Colonel Melchett had returned to the county town. Miss Marple remained by the fire, her knitting at last in her hands, the needles moving with their familiar soft click. Miss Henshaw hovered for a time, then withdrew. The vicar looked in once, murmured something about the strangeness of the human heart, and retreated to his study. Only Sir Henry stayed. "You knew it was Adair before we found the handle," he said. Miss Marple did not look up from her work. "I suspected, when I remembered, that the boundary report had been written by the schoolmaster. A man who deals in precise lines and measurements does not easily forget an injury done to his reputation, and a man who has lived for years with quiet malice directed against him may, in the end, decide to answer it in kind. The rest was only a matter of noticing which pieces fitted." Sir Henry watched the fire. "The Varleys can stay now, I suppose." "Yes, though the village will take time to look them full in the face again. People do not like being shown how readily they believe the worst." Outside, the wind moved through the orchards one last time, and somewhere in the dark a late apple fell. The sound was soft, final, like a page turned. Miss Marple finished her row and laid the knitting aside. For a moment she seemed older than her years, and then the familiar mild expression returned. "It is always the same," she said. "In St. Mary Mead or in Little Folding, the same small hatreds grow in the same quiet corners. One only has to recognize the pattern." Sir Henry smiled faintly. "And you always do." She rose, smoothed her skirt, and glanced toward the window where the night had fully settled. "Not always," she said, "but often enough." The clock on the mantel struck 9. In the orchards the last of the harvest waited for the morning, and the village of Little Folding, having looked for a moment into its own shadowed heart, prepared to sleep. Miss Marple turned down the lamp. The story was over.